What's going on, everybody? My name is Tenebrous Infinite, and before we get into the video here, I just wanted to say that Generation Zero's been having a free weekend on Steam so far, so if any of you guys haven't picked this game up yet, and maybe want to give it a shot before you spend your money on it, definitely go on over to Steam and check that out. As well, on G2A and Steam, there is a sale going on, so you have even more incentive to actually pick this game up. But with that out of the way, let's get into testing out these experimental weapons. What's going on, everybody? My name is Tenebrous Infinite, and welcome to a very special, very exciting video for you dudes. I've managed to collect all of the experimental weapons, so in today's video we're going to be going over the strengths and potential weaknesses of these new experimental weapons that the developers have added in the Rivals update. Now, I gotta say that these experimental weapons are hella cool. They are super fun to use, and they totally change the way combat can play out here in Generation Zero. There's a number of really strong benefits to these weapons, so when we talk about these weapons, we'll talk about their experimental factor, and then we'll show some footage of them being tested out in the field in the middle of combat. So we're starting off the video here off at the Skite Club, and we're going to be testing the rounds per minute of the Kapus and the effective range of the various sorts of ammunition that you can put into the experimental 12 gauge. I feel like this information will be really helpful for you dudes, because that way you'll be able to know how much ammunition you should be regularly stocking for your Kapus, and you'll be able to understand the effective range of each of these different sorts of ammunition for the shotgun. Understanding that effective range will really help you out in combat and help you out in knowing what sort of ammunition you'll personally want to stock for the shotgun. So let's start off with the Kapus. With the last Kapus test that we did when we were testing the SMGs, we found out that the Kapus was about 450 rounds per minute. So with the overdrive effect on the new experimental Kapus, I'm guessing that we're going to see maybe like 1.5 times the amount of speed on that and the amount of rounds per minute. But let's put it through the round, put it through the test, and see what that actual RPM is. So from that test, we could find out that the experimental Kapus really isn't that much faster. Sure, it shoots out its rounds a little bit faster, but you only really see it pick up speed from the original base speed towards the end of the clip, because the way the experimental Kapus overdrive works is as each shot comes out, it fires faster. So the lower you go in your clip, the more rounds you're going to be shooting out, as long as you're keeping that fire button held. So it only worked out to being about 10 rounds faster than the typical Kapus. So you don't really need to keep that much extra stock for the experimental Kapus. I think that that's pretty good. I had personally expected it to be a lot higher than that, but with that sort of information, it's good to know that you won't need to stock up on thousands and thousands of rounds for the experimental Kapus in order for it to still be efficient. It would be nice to someday see some gun come into the game that cracks the 600 rounds per minute rate of fire, but for now, I do think that this is the fastest gun in the game, and really, in the end, it still totally serves its purpose, because as you're hammering away on the enemy, you probably do want that round per minute to go up just a little bit in order to soak off that extra damage a little bit quicker than you normally would. Now for the 12 gauge, this is a pretty unique weapon that they've introduced into the game here. So basically, each of the different rounds has a different effective range that you can use them at. So we're going to start off with the bird shot, then we'll go through the buckshot, and then we'll look at the slugs for each of the effective ranges. For the bird shot, you're able to use it at pretty decent ranges, almost up to the same range that you would be able to use bird shot in a standard shotgun. So you can see that we were even able to reach the very far back target there. Now let's take a bit of a step back and see how far we can push this maximum range to. Alright, so we can hop up onto the little ledge here. And there you go, you're starting to see the range drop off as the rounds are starting to scatter on the ground. So roughly from about here to the maximum target is the maximum range you can use the bird shot. I would say that this is something like maybe 30 meters away, something like that, roughly. Next up, we're going to test out the buckshot and see how this goes. So for the buckshot, the range is reduced. We're going to start off here, just at this little spot right here, the little rock ledge thing. And so it's not effective from that range. But there you go, just a little bit closer. So this is probably about 10 meters away, I would say. It would be really nice if we do get a shooting range in the future that maybe has like the meter markers on the ground or something like that. That would be really cool to see. But now for the last bit of ammunition that you can use here, the slugs. Now the slugs have gotten a bit of a bad rap, but today I'd like to really test them out to see if they're actually effective to use in combat. So for the slugs, you have to be really, really close up to the enemy. Bjorn stated in the stream from last week that this is essentially Generation Zero's melee weapon for now. We might see actual melee weapons in the future, but for now, the only melee option we have is the slug in the experimental 12 gauge. So, in order to use the slug in the 12 gauge, you gotta be pretty dang close. I think anywhere from here to a little bit closer. So let's see. Okay, so we have to get a bit closer. And even closer. And there we go. So maybe about a meter away. Maybe a bit less than that. But I'm really hopeful that the slugs will have some sort of important combat factor that we'll be able to test out when we bring this out into the field. So far for looking at the weapons, it seems like at least for the 12 gauge and for the Kapus, they've been balanced pretty well, actually. I've seen across the forums that some people have been nervous about the balance of the game after introducing these new experimental weapons. But I would say that due to the shotgun having limited range with both the buckshot and the slug, which are the main damage dealing potential in the shotgun, that's a pretty good way of balancing the gun. Now, the added effect of being able to stagger the opponent maybe 80% of the time is where you see the shotgun be incredibly powerful, but that's more so in tactile use as opposed to one gun versus the other gun. And with the Kapus, again, you know, having only just a moderately higher rate of fire due to it only being the tail end of your magazine that has the maximum rate of fire, I think that means that you can still use your Kapus if you so choose, if you don't like the added effects of the experimental weapons. So with a little bit of testing that we've done at the firing range now, let's take these weapons out into the field and really see how effective these things are. I'm going to be highlighting most of the major strengths of these guns and a couple weaknesses of these guns as well. So let's just get going, find ourselves some machines and start wrecking them up. So first off, we have the experimental 12 gauge. And right now I was using the slug rounds to test them out, and they were pretty ineffective, but this happened. That was pretty funny. So it took a little while, but eventually I was able to actually kill a runner using the slugs. Next up, we've got the buckshot, and the buckshot, as I've said, does a higher base damage than the birdshot, so it can be a little bit more useful when you've got these close quarters combat situations, especially situations where you're being swarmed by a lot of enemies, because the stagger chance will help keep individual enemies distracted, while the higher base damage will help you actually take out the enemies a little bit quicker than the birdshot will. And then lastly here, we're demonstrating the range of the birdshot, in which case you're able to stun lock your enemy from a very safe distance and mitigate almost all of the damage that you would normally take. The military tanks are one of the most threatening enemies in this game, and the fact that the experimental 12 gauge makes taking them on a little bit easier is a huge benefit to the experimental 12 gauge. Though, as I stated earlier, the downside to the birdshot is that it can turn fighting things into a little bit of a slog, because you'll be doing less base damage overall. Now for the Kapus. The Kapus is deadly at close range, and the fact that the rate of fire increases as you go through the clip means that you'll be able to punch out the DPS needed to take on enemies. In my personal opinion, this Kapus just eats through hunters. Now for a little bit of utilitarian use out of the clock. If you ever run into a tank that has a glitched out tick pod, you can utilize the clock to stun the tank and eventually take them down. But here's a little bit of a downside to the clock. Say you get your EMP stun on the enemy. Next up, if you get that second EMP stun while the enemy is recovering from the EMP, it will not affect them. Now for the GRG, basically it's really useful against the bigger enemies in the game, because the spread from it is pretty inaccurate. But if you can manage to control the recoil from it, it can be sometimes pretty effective for taking out a larger group of enemies. Now for the AG4, one of my personal favorites from these experimental weapons. The burn effect over time from the AG4 is incredibly useful. You'll be able to use that burn effect to chip away at components and kind of forget about them and leave them. And as it burns away, it does more and more damage to the actual component. The other factor for the fire too is that the more fire you have going on the individual location, the more damage it's going to do over time. So sometimes it can be much more effective to just kind of blast into individual components and let the fire do the work for you. Now for the PVG here, just kind of demonstrating its ability in close range combat. It's quite useful at close range because it does just such a crazy amount of damage. It's definitely one of the best weapons to take on hunters with. Also, its ability to maintain its damage at crazy long distances means that the experimental PVG is easily the best sniper in the game for crazy long-range combat. Even though it's a little bit hard to tell on the console versions, even if it doesn't look like you're doing damage to the opponent that you're shooting from a crazy long distance, you are, and the enemy will usually go down in a clip and a half. And now, just to really quickly demonstrate the penetration of the PVG, I was able to hit both of those Seekers there. And when you're fighting Harvester, you can actually shoot out all of the gas pods on its back. So you'll notice here that these gas pods have been destroyed from that single shot. So there you guys go. I would say that these weapons are pretty dang balanced and really fun to use. The GRG having that kind of crazy inaccuracy to it means that the GRG itself is maybe not the experimental weapon that you want to go for, unless if you really enjoy just causing crazy explosions all over the place. I do think that the GRG is great for fighting against heavy units, but that's pretty much it. An added benefit, though, is because you can fire off 2 HEDP rounds at once, it can be really useful for fighting hunters, as long as you're using it effectively and RNG is being kind to you and that second round isn't just flying off into the distance. For the PVG, it's crazy, my dear. It's such a good weapon. The fact that you could take it and shoot through the 3 gas canisters on the Harvester's back means that you could take down Harvesters much faster. The fact that you can use it at a crazy range against enemies is incredibly useful for it. And I feel like the experimental PVG is the answer to a lot of us that felt that the base 50 cal was a little underpowered. For the Kapus, you were able to see that tail end, as I had said at the beginning of the video, that tail end of increased rounds per minute actually does add a lot of an impact in the middle of combat, even if it only adds 10 rounds per minute. Those 10 rounds per minute really make a difference. For the AG4, getting the fire effect and being able to kind of shoot the enemy and forget about it is really nice and really useful. The damage that fire does to components is great. It's fantastic, and the way you could stack it and everything like that means that the AG4 is now one of the most tactile assault rifles that you could use. The shotgun, though the slugs were a little bit disappointing, everything else about the shotgun is fantastic. That stagger chance against larger enemies and the added impact of that little bit of damage that you can get off those flechette rounds means that you'll be able to take down the weaker enemies like Seekers and Runners a lot more easily with the experimental 12 gauge. And for the experimental clock, I think that added 10% EMP effect is, or roughly 10% EMP effect, is really useful against larger enemies where you're just dumping your rounds into them. Maybe isn't so useful against the smaller enemies where you're going to be picking off individual precise shots, but the added benefit of the clock is that since it's a 10% chance, it's all up to RNG. You technically could get 2 EMPs in the span of a single clip, or you might get only 1 EMP in the span of 2 clips, all depending on how lucky you are. There's all of my observations that I can make for the new experimental weapons, and a little bit of testing, a little bit of field footage shown off to you guys. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this little video, enjoyed the information dump about these experimental weapons. If there's anything you guys have to add for these experimental weapons, definitely slap it up in the comments down below. Thank you so much for watching, and I will catch you guys on the next one. Until then, peace.